On a frigid winter evening, when darkness descended like a heavy curtain and the wind howled with the voice of 1,000 ghosts, 72-year-old Thomas McAllister heard something that would forever change the course of his solitary life. It started as a scratching sound at his door. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackling fire and the relentless moan of the Alaskan wind. But then it grew more insistent, more desperate. And beneath it all, cutting through the storm's fury like a knife through flesh, came a sound that made Thomas's weathered heart constrict with recognition. The soft, sorrowful whimpering of creatures in mortal distress. What Thomas saw when he finally gathered the courage to peer through his frost-etched window made his hands tremble and his breath catch in his throat. 2 wolves stood on his porch, their bodies illuminated by the weak yellow glow of his porch light. But these weren't the magnificent predators of legend and nightmare. These were desperate shadows of what wolves should be, their once proud forms reduced to trembling skeletons barely held together by matted fur and sheer force of will. Instead of baring fangs or growling with territorial rage, these majestic yet terrifying creatures appeared utterly broken. They pawed at his door as though pleading for refuge, their eyes reflecting not menace but something far more unsettling: hope. The desperate, dying hope of beings who had reached the absolute end of their endurance. When Thomas finally opened that door, he couldn't have anticipated the life-altering journey that awaited him. What exactly did these frozen wolves want? And why would they choose a human's warm hearth over the wild expanse they called home? Thomas McAllister was no stranger to harsh winters. Having lived in the remote Alaskan countryside for 43 years, he was well acquainted with sub-zero temperatures, howling winds that could strip the skin from your face, and a darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. His log cabin, sturdy and weathered, stood as a living testament to years of surviving in one of Earth's most unforgiving climates. Every log bore the marks of his labor, every stone in the chimney held a memory, every crack in the floorboards told a story. Yet despite his rugged experience and his intimate knowledge of winter's cruelty, nothing could have prepared Thomas for the sight that greeted him late that snowy evening. It had been an ordinary day, or as ordinary as any day could be when you lived alone at the edge of civilization. Thomas had chopped enough firewood to last through the long night ahead, his aged muscles protesting with every swing of the axe but his pride refusing to let him stop until the job was done properly. He checked on his small vegetable greenhouse, the one luxury he allowed himself, where a few stubborn tomato plants defied the season with the help of a single electric heater. The tomatoes were Margaret's favorite, he thought, as he always did when he tended them. Even 5 years after her death, he couldn't quite break the habit of growing them. As dusk fell and the temperature plummeted to dangerous levels, Thomas had retreated indoors, content to spend the long, dark hours by his crackling fireplace with a mug of hot tea liberally spiked with whiskey and his well-worn copy of Call of the Wild. The irony of the title would only become apparent to him later. He'd been reading for perhaps an hour, lost in Jack London's tale of survival and transformation, when the scratching began. At first, Thomas assumed it was a branch blown against the door by the wind. That happened sometimes during storms, though usually with more violence and less purpose. But when the scratching persisted, joined by those haunting whimpers, Thomas set down his book and felt the first stirrings of unease. Wild animals didn't approach human dwellings. Not in his experience. Bears might raid garbage cans in town, and foxes sometimes skulked around looking for scraps. But here in the deep wilderness, animals gave humans a wide berth. It was an unspoken rule of the frontier: you keep to your territory and we'll keep to ours. So what could possibly be scratching at his door? Thomas stood slowly, his joints crackling in protest. 72 years of hard living had left their mark on his body. His back had been injured in a logging accident 30 years ago and never quite healed properly. His left knee, shattered in a fall during his first winter here, ached with relentless determination whenever a storm approached. His hands, once strong enough to fell trees and build a cabin from scratch, now trembled slightly with age and arthritis. But his mind remained sharp, and his instincts, honed by decades of wilderness living, were sounding alarm bells. He grabbed the flashlight he kept by the door, its weight familiar and reassuring in his palm. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he also took down his rifle from the rack above the fireplace. He didn't want to use it, had always hated killing, but in the wilderness being unprepared could mean being dead. Thomas approached the window beside the door, moving carefully to avoid making the floorboards creak. His breath fogged the cold glass as he leaned close, using his sleeve to wipe away a circle in the frost that had accumulated on the inside of the pane. What he saw made his heart begin to pound with a mixture of fear, awe, and something he couldn't quite name. 2 wolves stood on his porch, their forms ghostly in the swirling snow. At first glance, they appeared massive, dangerous, exactly the sort of wild predators that populated frontier nightmares and campfire tales. But as Thomas's eyes adjusted and he truly looked at them, his perception shifted dramatically. These wolves were dying. Their once magnificent coats were matted and dull, crusted with ice and hanging limply from frames so emaciated that every rib showed through like the struts of an umbrella. Their breath came in visible clouds, rapid and shallow, speaking of exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. This was the exhaustion of beings who had pushed themselves to the absolute limit and beyond, who had kept going long past the point where their bodies begged them to simply lie down in the snow and surrender. The smaller of the two wolves, a female with a patch of silver fur across her shoulders that caught the porch light, was holding her right hind leg at an odd angle, clearly injured. Even from inside the cabin, Thomas could see the swelling, the unnatural way she kept the paw lifted off the ground. How long had she been traveling on 3 legs? How much pain must she be enduring? The larger wolf, a male with a long, ugly scar running down his muzzle from some past battle, stood protectively close to his injured companion. His eyes scanned the darkness constantly, ever vigilant for threats even in his own moment of desperate need. He was clearly the guardian, the protector, and he had led them here for a reason. But it was their behavior that truly stunned Thomas. Instead of snarling or acting with the aggressive unpredictability he expected from wild predators, they were trembling with cold and exhaustion. The female lifted her good front paw and scratched weakly at the door again, and the sound was so pathetic, so utterly devoid of threat, that Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. The male wolf turned his head and looked directly at the window where Thomas stood. Their eyes met through the frost-etched glass, and in that moment, Thomas saw something that challenged every assumption he'd ever held about wild animals. He saw intelligence. He saw desperation. He saw a plea for help so profound and so honest that it transcended the barrier of species. These wolves had come to him not as predators seeking prey, but as desperate souls seeking refuge. Thomas's instincts battled fiercely with his caution. Wolves were, after all, wild predators. Powerful, potentially deadly, completely unpredictable. Everything he'd ever learned about wilderness survival screamed at him to leave them outside, to perhaps throw out some food if he felt charitable, but under no circumstances to open that door. But Thomas had also learned, in his 72 years on this earth, that sometimes the greatest moments of your life came from the decisions that made the least logical sense. He thought of Margaret, his late wife, who had died 5 winters ago in her sleep, peaceful and pain-free but still far too soon. Margaret, who had possessed a heart so large it sometimes seemed impossible that her small frame could contain it. Margaret, who had never met a wounded creature she wouldn't try to save, whether it was a baby bird fallen from its nest or a half-frozen fox kit she'd found during a spring thaw. "What would you do, my love?" Thomas whispered to the empty cabin. But he already knew the answer. Margaret would have opened the door without hesitation. She would have welcomed these desperate creatures with the same warmth she'd shown every living thing, human or otherwise, that crossed her path. Against every dictate of common sense, against the screaming protests of his survival instincts, against his better judgment, Thomas McAllister set down his rifle, grabbed his flashlight more firmly and reached for the door handle. His hand paused there for a moment, fingers wrapped around the cold metal, heart hammering in his chest like a drum. This was it. The moment of decision. Open this door and everything would change. He could feel it in his bones, that certainty that comes rarely in life but when it does, cannot be ignored. "Well," he said aloud to the empty room, his voice cracking from disuse and emotion, "I've lived a long life. If this is how it ends, at least it'll be interesting." With a deep breath that misted in the cold air of his cabin, Thomas McAllister turned the handle and pulled open the door. The cold hit Thomas like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. The temperature had dropped even further, the thermometer by the door now reading -32 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, exposed skin could develop frostbite in minutes. The wind cut through his flannel shirt like it was tissue paper, and he immediately regretted not grabbing his coat. But all thoughts of his own discomfort vanished as he stood face to face with the two wolves. They were even more pitiful up close. The female's silver-patched coat was matted with ice and dried blood. Her injured leg was so swollen it looked painful just to look at. Her ribs stood out so sharply that Thomas could have counted them from where he stood. Her eyes, though, were what truly captured him. They were a pale amber color, almost gold, and they held an intelligence that was almost human in its depth. The male wolf was slightly larger but equally ravaged by hardship. The scar on his muzzle was old but vicious, speaking of a fight that must have been brutal. His own ribs were equally visible beneath his matted fur, and Thomas noticed now that his paws were cracked and bleeding from traveling across ice and frozen ground. For a long moment, nobody moved. Man and beast regarded each other across the threshold of the cabin, each waiting to see what the other would do. The wind howled around them, snow swirling in miniature tornadoes, and the cold pressed in from all sides like a living thing with hungry hands. "Well," Thomas said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind, "are you coming in or not? I'm freezing out here even if you two are used to it." He stepped back slowly, carefully, making himself smaller, less threatening. He'd learned long ago from observing animals that sudden movements and aggressive postures triggered defensive responses. If these wolves were going to trust him, he needed to show them he wasn't a threat. The two wolves looked at each other, and Thomas could have sworn they were communicating somehow. The male's ears twitched, and the female made a soft sound in her throat. Then, moving with heartbreaking caution, the male wolf took a single step across the threshold. He stopped immediately, nose working, eyes scanning every corner of the cabin visible from his position. He was alert for danger, for traps, for any sign that this human's apparent kindness was a deception. Thomas remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, giving the wolf time to assess the situation. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the male wolf took another step inside. Then another. And then finally he was fully across the threshold, standing in Thomas's cabin, looking around with those intelligent, cautious eyes. The female followed immediately after, limping badly on 3 legs, her injured paw held carefully off the ground. The moment she crossed the threshold and the cabin's warmth touched her ice-crusted fur, Thomas saw a visible shudder run through her entire body. It was as if she'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will, and now, finally safe, that iron control was beginning to crack. Thomas closed the door carefully, sealing out the deadly cold and the screaming wind. The sudden silence was almost shocking. All that remained was the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the sound of 6 beings breathing. 1 human, 2 wolves, and 3 rapidly beating hearts. The wolves stood just inside the door, neither advancing nor retreating, clearly unsure what to do next. They were wild creatures in a human dwelling, and every instinct they possessed must have been screaming at them to flee. But their desperate need for warmth and shelter was clearly stronger than their fear. Thomas moved slowly toward his armchair, giving the wolves a wide berth, showing them through his actions that he wasn't going to corner them or block their escape route. He sat down heavily, his old joints protesting, and simply watched them. "It's all right," he murmured, keeping his voice low and calm. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." The wolves didn't understand his words, of course, but his tone seemed to soothe them slightly. Their tense postures relaxed fractionally, though they remained alert and ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Slowly, cautiously they began to explore. The male wolf moved first, his nose to the ground, sniffing at Thomas's furniture, his bookshelf, the pile of firewood stacked neatly by the hearth. He moved with the grace of a predator despite his emaciated condition, every step calculated, every movement economical. The female stayed closer to the door initially, watching her companion's exploration with those luminous amber eyes. But then she turned her attention to the fire. Thomas watched, fascinated, as she limped toward the hearth, drawn by the heat like a moth to flame. She'd probably never been this close to fire before, certainly not in a contained, controlled setting like this. Wild wolves had an instinctive fear of fire, born of lightning strikes and forest blazes. But this wolf's need for warmth had apparently overcome her natural caution. She stopped about 3 feet from the hearth, close enough to feel the radiating heat but not so close as to be in danger. And then, with a sigh that sounded almost human in its profound relief, she slowly lowered herself to the floor and lay down. The male wolf immediately abandoned his exploration and moved to her side, pressing close against her, offering his body's warmth in addition to the fire's heat. He positioned himself between her and Thomas, still protective, still wary, but clearly less fearful than he had been moments ago. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. There was something profoundly moving about the scene before him. These wild creatures, these apex predators who should have been terrors of the wilderness, were instead huddled together by his fire, seeking nothing more than warmth and safety. They asked for so little. They needed so much. "You must be starving," Thomas said softly. At the sound of his voice, both wolves' ears swiveled toward him, but neither moved or showed aggression. They simply watched him with those intelligent, assessing eyes. Thomas stood slowly, telegraphing his movements, making no sudden gestures. He moved toward his small kitchen area, acutely aware of the wolves' eyes tracking his every step. He'd been planning to cook the venison steak he'd thawed for dinner, maybe make a simple stew with some of the vegetables from his greenhouse. But his dinner could wait. These wolves needed food far more desperately than he did. He pulled the venison from his refrigerator, plus 2 more steaks from his freezer. He'd shot the deer himself last fall before the truly brutal cold set in, and he'd carefully butchered and preserved every ounce of meat. It was supposed to last him through the winter. But looking at the skeletal wolves huddled by his fire, Thomas knew he wouldn't begrudge them a single bite. He placed the 3 raw steaks on a large metal plate, the same one he used when he ate supper in front of the fire. The meat was still partially frozen, but he figured the wolves wouldn't mind. In their condition, they'd probably eat tree bark if he offered it. Carrying the plate carefully, moving slowly and deliberately, Thomas approached the wolves. He stopped about 6 feet away from them, not wanting to enter their space and trigger a defensive response. "Here," he said softly, setting the plate down on the floor. "I know it's not much, but it's what I have." He backed away quickly, returning to his armchair and making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. For a moment, neither wolf moved. They stared at the plate of meat, then at Thomas, then back at the meat as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. The male wolf's nose worked overtime, testing the air, analyzing the scent of the venison, checking for any hint of poison or danger. Then, moving with heartbreaking caution, the female wolf struggled to her feet. She limped toward the plate, her injured leg held carefully off the ground, her body trembling with weakness and hunger. She sniffed at the meat once, twice, and then she lunged. Thomas had never seen anything eat with such desperate urgency. The female wolf tore into the venison like a living creature possessed by hunger itself, ripping and tearing and swallowing with barely any chewing. The partially frozen meat didn't slow her down at all. She ate with the single-minded focus of a being who hadn't had a proper meal in weeks, possibly months. The male wolf joined her immediately, and together they devoured all 3 steaks in less than 90 seconds. When the plate was clean, licked so thoroughly it shone, both wolves looked up at Thomas with expressions that could only be described as grateful. The female wolf, her muzzle still stained with blood from the meat, did something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. She limped toward him, moving slowly, her body language submissive and non-threatening. She stopped just a few feet away from his chair, close enough that Thomas could have reached out and touched her if he'd wanted to. And then, very gently, very deliberately, she lowered her head and wagged her tail. It was the briefest gesture, over in a heartbeat. But in that moment, Thomas felt something shift in the universe. This wild creature, this magnificent predator who should have feared or hated humans, was thanking him. She was showing gratitude, trust, and perhaps the beginning of something that might, against all odds, become friendship. "You're welcome, girl," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're very welcome." The female wolf held his gaze for another moment, those amber eyes seeming to look right through him to his very soul. Then she turned and limped back to the fire, where she lowered herself to the floor with a groan of relief and exhaustion. The male wolf followed, pressing close against her, offering warmth and protection. But Thomas noticed that this time, the male didn't position himself quite so defensively between the female and Thomas. It was a small change, subtle but significant. The wolf was beginning to trust him. The hours that followed were among the strangest and most profound of Thomas McAllister's long life. He sat in his armchair, occasionally tending the fire to keep it burning strong and warm, while the 2 wolves dozed fitfully on the braided rug by the hearth. Outside, the wind continued its relentless howling, and the temperature dropped even further into dangerous, deadly territory. But inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a peace that Thomas hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. He tried to read his book, but the words kept blurring on the page. His mind was too full of questions, wonder, and a growing sense of responsibility that both thrilled and terrified him. What was he going to do with 2 wild wolves in his cabin? Keep them here forever? That was absurd. They were wild animals, not pets. They belonged in the wilderness, running free with their pack, hunting and living as nature intended. But the female wolf's injury was severe. She wouldn't survive a week in the wild in her current condition. And the male wolf, devoted and protective as he clearly was, wouldn't abandon her. If Thomas sent them back out into that frozen wasteland, he'd be sending them to their deaths. He needed help. Professional help. But that meant reaching out to the authorities, to wildlife services, to rangers and veterinarians. And what would they do? Would they help these wolves? Or would they decide that wild predators who'd been living in close proximity to a human were too dangerous to be allowed to live? Thomas had heard stories of problem bears being put down, of wolves deemed threats to livestock being eliminated. The thought of these magnificent creatures, These desperate survivors who trusted him enough to seek his help, being destroyed because of some bureaucratic protocol made his blood run cold. He looked at his satellite phone sitting on the shelf, its battery dead because he'd forgotten to charge it days ago. It would take hours to get enough power for even a short call. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe fate was telling him to wait, to think, to make sure he knew what he was doing before he brought the outside world into this fragile, miraculous situation. Around midnight, Thomas dozed off in his chair, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the evening. He woke with a start some time later to find the male wolf standing at the base of the stairs that led up to his sleeping loft, looking up at him with those penetrating eyes. For a moment, man and beast stared at each other in the darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire. Then, satisfied with whatever he saw, the wolf turned and went back to his companion, curling around her protectively. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes once again. The wolf had been checking on him, making sure he was safe. This wild predator, who had every reason to fear and distrust humans, had been concerned enough to climb the stairs and verify that Thomas was all right. "Thank you," Thomas whispered into the darkness. He descended from his loft slowly, mindful of his creaking joints and the wolf's light sleep. He added more wood to the fire, stoking the embers until flames danced high and bright again. The warmth spread through the cabin, and he saw both wolves relax further in their sleep. Thomas prepared a makeshift bed for them, arranging his spare blankets in the warmest corner of the cabin, the ones his late wife Margaret had quilted during their first winter here. Each stitch had been a labor of love, each pattern a piece of their shared history. Margaret would have wanted these blankets to be used for exactly this purpose, Thomas was certain. "Here," he said softly, gesturing to the pile of blankets. "This'll be more comfortable than the hard floor." The wolves woke and watched him warily as he arranged the bedding. But when he stepped back and they investigated the soft, warm blankets, Thomas saw something like relief in their eyes. The female especially seemed grateful, her exhausted body sinking into the quilted layers with a long, shuddering sigh. The male wolf circled the makeshift bed twice before settling down, still positioned protectively around the female but no longer quite so tense and ready for violence. Thomas returned to his loft but found sleep elusive. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the gentle sounds of wolves breathing below, the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside. His mind raced with thoughts and plans and worries. Before he finally drifted off, he reached over to his nightstand and picked up the framed photograph that sat there. Margaret, laughing, her hair wild in the wind, holding a baby fox they'd once rescued during a harsh spring. Her eyes sparkled with joy and mischief and that boundless compassion that had defined every day of their life together. "I know what you'd say, love," Thomas murmured to the photograph. "You'd say I'm doing the right thing. You'd say these wolves deserve a chance, just like every other creature that's ever needed help. You'd tell me to trust my heart." He set the photograph down gently and stared at the rough-hewn beams of his ceiling, visible in the faint glow from the fire below. "I'm trying, Margaret," he whispered. "I'm trying to be the man you always believed I was." And with that prayer, that promise, Thomas McAllister finally surrendered to sleep. Thomas woke to pale winter sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the sound of movement below. For one disoriented moment, he thought he'd dreamed the entire previous evening. 2 wolves in his cabin? Impossible. Ridiculous. Clearly the product of too much whiskey in his tea and too much loneliness. But then he heard it clearly, the soft click of claws on his wooden floor. His heart leaped as he carefully descended the stairs from his loft, half expecting to find his cabin destroyed, his furniture chewed, chaos reigning. But the scene that greeted him was surprisingly peaceful. Both wolves were awake and alert, sitting near the fire, watching him with calm, assessing eyes. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was disturbed. His books remained on their shelves, his furniture stood intact. Even his precious collection of Margaret's china teacups sat unbroken in their cabinet. The wolves had simply waited. "Good morning," Thomas said, his voice rusty with sleep. The sound of it in the quiet cabin made both wolves' ears swivel toward him, but neither showed fear or aggression. They simply watched, waiting to see what this strange human would do next. Thomas moved slowly through his morning routine, hyper-aware of the wolves' eyes following his every move. He stoked the fire, adding fresh logs until flames roared high and bright. He put on a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin. And all the while he studied his unexpected guest. In the clear light of morning, their condition appeared even worse than it had the night before. Both wolves were catastrophically thin, their ribs and hip bones standing out sharply beneath their matted fur. But it was the female's injured leg that truly concerned Thomas. The swelling had increased overnight, and the leg was being held at an even more unnatural angle. Thomas had lived in the wilderness long enough to have learned rudimentary first aid for both humans and animals. He'd once set the broken leg of Jacob Patterson's sled dog when the nearest vet was 3 days away by snowmobile. He'd treated frostbite on his own fingers, stitched up a gash in his arm that probably should have killed him, and even once helped a cow give birth when a neighboring homesteader had needed assistance. But a wolf? That was different entirely. That was dangerous. Still, he couldn't just watch the poor creature suffer. He retrieved his first aid kit from the bathroom, a battered metal box that had been with him since his days as a young man working the logging camps. It was filled with an assortment of bandages, antiseptics, painkillers, and various other medical supplies he'd accumulated over 4 decades of wilderness living. The male wolf's eyes tracked Thomas as he carried the first aid kit into the main room. When Thomas knelt down several feet away from the female and opened the box with a loud click, both wolves flinched, the male rising to his feet with a low rumble building in his chest. "Easy," Thomas murmured, his voice calm and soothing despite his racing heart. "Easy, big fella. I'm just trying to help your friend here. See?" He held up a roll of bandages. "Just medical supplies. Nothing scary." He extended his hand slowly, palm down, letting the wolves catch his scent. This was the crucial moment. Would they trust him enough to allow him to touch the injured female? Or would the male wolf's protective instincts override any fragile trust they'd begun to build? The female wolf watched Thomas with those luminous amber eyes, her breathing rapid and shallow with pain. She was trembling slightly, whether from fear, cold, or suffering Thomas couldn't tell. Probably all three. "I know you're hurting, sweetheart," Thomas said softly. "I know I'm a stranger and this is terrifying. But please let me help you. I promise I won't hurt you any more than I have to." He inched closer, moving with painstaking slowness, giving the wolves every opportunity to object or retreat. The male wolf stood rigid, every muscle tensed, ready to attack if Thomas made one wrong move. But he didn't advance or growl. He simply watched with burning intensity. When Thomas's fingers finally made contact with the female's matted fur, she flinched but didn't pull away. He could feel her trembling beneath his touch, could sense her fear and pain radiating from her like heat from a fire. "That's it," he murmured encouragingly. "That's a brave girl. I'm just going to take a look at this leg, okay?" Very gently, moving with the kind of care he'd normally reserve for handling nitroglycerin, Thomas examined the injured leg. What he found made his heart sink. The injury was far worse than he'd initially thought. The swelling extended from her paw all the way up to her hip, hot and angry to the touch. There was an old wound, partially healed but clearly infected, just above the joint where some trap or territorial fight had gouged a deep furrow in her flesh. Frostbite had damaged the pads of her paw so severely that the tissue had begun to turn black. This wolf was in serious, potentially life-threatening trouble. "Oh, sweetheart," Thomas breathed, his voice thick with sympathy and concern. "You've been carrying this for weeks, haven't you? Maybe longer. How are you even still walking?" The female wolf whimpered softly as Thomas's gentle probing found a particularly tender spot. The male wolf took a step forward, a warning growl rumbling from his chest. I know, Thomas said quickly. "I know it hurts her. But I have to check the damage so I can help her properly." He worked as quickly and gently as he could, cleaning the infected wound with antiseptic that made the wolf flinch and whine. Each time she whimpered, the male wolf's growl intensified, and Thomas found himself praying that the protective companion's restraint would hold. "You're doing so well," Thomas murmured, addressing both wolves now. "Both of you are being so brave. Just a little longer, I promise." He applied antibiotic ointment to the infection, then turned his attention to the frostbitten paw pads. The damage here was severe, and Thomas wasn't sure if the tissue could be saved. But he cleaned them carefully anyway, applied a special ointment meant for severe burns and frostbite, and then began the delicate process of wrapping the entire leg in clean gauze bandages. Throughout the process, which took nearly 45 minutes, the female wolf remained remarkably still. She whimpered and trembled, her eyes squeezed shut against the pain, but she never snapped or tried to pull away. It was as if she understood, on some instinctive level, that this temporary pain was necessary for healing. And the male wolf, for all his protective instincts and territorial wariness, allowed Thomas to continue his work. He watched every movement with laser focus, ready to intervene in a heartbeat if Thomas's ministrations crossed some invisible line from healing to harm. But that moment never came. When Thomas finally finished wrapping the bandage and sat back on his heels, exhausted and emotionally drained, the female wolf opened her eyes and looked directly at him. And then, in a gesture that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat and tears spring to his eyes, she leaned forward and very gently touched her cold nose to his hand. It was the briefest contact, over in less than a second. But in that moment, Thomas felt a connection that transcended species, that spoke to something fundamental about compassion and trust and the bonds that can form between any living creatures when fear gives way to understanding. "You're welcome," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "You're very, very welcome." The remainder of that day passed in a strange kind of domesticity that Thomas could never have imagined. He cooked himself breakfast, eggs and bacon, and found himself automatically frying extra portions for his unexpected guests. The wolves accepted his offering with less desperate urgency than the night before, eating with what almost seemed like gratitude rather than mere hunger. Thomas tried to settle into his normal routine, reading by the fire, tending to small chores around the cabin, but his mind kept circling back to the same unavoidable question. What was he going to do? The female wolf needed professional veterinary care, that much was clear. Her infection could worsen, could spread through her bloodstream, could kill her within days if not properly treated. He'd done what he could with his limited supplies and knowledge, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. But reaching out for help meant risking everything. Wildlife authorities might decide the wolves were too habituated to humans, too dangerous to be allowed to remain free. They might be taken away, put in cages, or worse, destroyed as potential threats to public safety. The thought of those scenarios made Thomas physically ill. Around noon he finally plugged in his satellite phone to charge. The battery indicator blinked sluggishly to life, showing him it would take several hours to accumulate enough power for even a short call. Maybe that was fate's way of telling him to slow down, to think carefully before he did something irreversible. He spent the afternoon watching the wolves. They fascinated him endlessly. The way they communicated with each other through subtle shifts in posture, minute changes in ear position, soft vocalizations that seemed to carry complex meaning. The obvious love between them, the bond that went deeper than mere pack loyalty or survival instinct. The male wolf never strayed more than a few feet from the female. When she shifted position, he immediately adjusted his own to accommodate her. When she whimpered in her sleep, he would gently nuzzle her head or press closer, offering comfort. When Thomas approached with fresh water or more food, the male positioned himself between Thomas and the female, not aggressively but protectively, making it clear that he would tolerate no threat to his companion. "She's lucky to have you," Thomas told the male wolf during one of these watchful moments. Not many beings in this world, human or animal, can count on that kind of devotion. The male wolf's amber eyes met his, and Thomas had the distinct impression that the sentiment was understood, if not the words themselves. As the afternoon light began to fade and Thomas prepared to venture outside to gather more firewood, a movement at the edge of the tree line caught his eye. He froze at the window, heart suddenly pounding, and grabbed his binoculars from their hook by the door. There, skulking at the very edge of his property where the cleared land met the dense forest, was another figure. At first Thomas thought it might be another wolf, but as he focused the binoculars, he realized it was human. A woman, bundled in a heavy parka with a fur-lined hood, stood partially hidden behind a thick pine. She was holding what looked like a tracking device, and her attention seemed focused on Thomas's cabin. His blood ran cold. How had she found them? Who was she? And what did she want with his wolves? Inside the cabin, the male wolf had already detected the intruder. His hackles rose and a low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The female struggled to her feet, whimpering, clearly distressed by her companion's agitation. "Easy," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the wolves or himself. "Easy now. Let me see what this is about." He grabbed his heavy coat and his rifle, though he prayed he wouldn't need the latter. Stepping out onto his porch, he was immediately struck by the brutal cold. The temperature had plummeted again, probably hovering somewhere around -35. At these temperatures, exposed skin could develop severe frostbite in minutes. "Hello," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the snow-covered expanse between his cabin and the tree line. "Can I help you?" The woman emerged from behind the tree, raising one hand in a gesture that was meant to be non-threatening. But Thomas noticed she kept the other hand on the tracking device. "Mr. McAllister?" she called back, her voice muffled slightly by the scarf wrapped around her lower face. "My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez. I'm from the Northern Wildlife Research Center. I've been tracking 2 wolves that went missing from a pack we've been monitoring. Their GPS collars last pinged from this area." Thomas felt his stomach drop. GPS collars. Of course. These wolves hadn't just randomly chosen his cabin out of the entire wilderness. They'd been tagged, studied, monitored by researchers. And now those researchers had come looking for their missing subjects. I don't know anything about wolves, Thomas lied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Dr. Rodriguez took a few steps closer, and Thomas could see that she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her early 40s, with dark, intelligent eyes visible above her scarf. Mr. McAllister, please, she said, and there was genuine desperation in her voice. If those wolves are here, they're in serious danger. The female, we call her Luna, she's injured. She won't survive much longer without proper medical attention. And her brother, Apollo, he won't leave her. They'll both die if we don't help them. Luna. Paul. The names hit Thomas like a physical blow. Suddenly these weren't just wolves. They were individuals with identities, with history, with people who knew them and cared about their welfare. How do I know you're who you say you are? Thomas demanded, though his heart was no longer in the deception. How do I know you won't hurt them? Dr. Rodriguez slowly reached into her parka pocket and pulled out an ID badge, holding it up for Thomas to see even from a distance. I've been studying this pack for 3 years, Mr. McAllister. I know every wolf by name, every family relationship, every hunting pattern. Luna and Apollo are siblings, the youngest breeding pair from the Silver Ridge pack. They got separated during a blizzard 3 weeks ago, and we feared the worst until their collar signals started pinging again near your property. Thomas stared at her, his mind racing. Everything about her demeanor, her obvious concern, her willingness to be out here in deadly cold tracking wayward wolves, spoke to genuine dedication. This wasn't some bureaucrat looking to eliminate problem animals. This was a researcher who cared deeply about her subjects. Come inside, Thomas said finally, lowering his rifle. Slowly. They're very skittish and I don't want them stressed. Dr. Rodriguez's face lit up with relief and gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. She approached the cabin with careful, measured steps, speaking in a low, soothing voice even before reaching the porch. Thank you, she said as she climbed the steps. Thank you so much. You have no idea how worried we've been. When Thomas led her inside, both wolves reacted immediately and dramatically. Apollo positioned himself squarely between Elena and Luna, his body rigid with tension, lips pulled back to reveal impressive fangs. A growl that would have terrified any sane person rumbled from his chest. But Dr. Elena Rodriguez did something that proved she knew exactly what she was doing. Instead of backing away or showing fear, she immediately dropped into a crouch, making herself small and non-threatening. She lowered her eyes, avoiding direct eye contact that could be interpreted as a challenge. Hey Apollo, she murmured, her voice carrying all the warmth and familiarity of greeting an old friend. Hey big guy. It's me. Remember? I'm the one who always brought the good venison, not that cheap processed stuff the other researchers used. To Thomas's amazement, Apollo's aggressive posture softened slightly. His ears, which had been flat against his skull in clear threat, lifted fractionally. His growl faded to uncertainty. That's right, Elena continued, inching forward with glacier-like slowness. You remember my scent, don't you? And Luna, sweet girl, let me see that leg. I heard you got hurt and I've been so worried. She glanced at Thomas, her eyes widening slightly as she noticed the professional bandaging on Luna's injured leg. You did this? She asked quietly. Thomas nodded, suddenly self-conscious. It was the best I could manage with what I had. I'm not a veterinarian. You probably saved her life, Elena said with quiet conviction. She turned her attention back to Luna, moving closer with infinite patience. Can I examine her? I promise I'll be gentle. I just need to see how bad it is. Over the next hour, Thomas watched in fascination as Dr. Elena Rodriguez demonstrated the expertise and compassion that had clearly led her to dedicate her life to studying these magnificent creatures. She examined both wolves thoroughly, her touch confident but gentle, her voice maintaining a constant stream of soothing commentary. She carefully removed Thomas's bandage and examined Luna's infected wound, nodding approval at his treatment. You cleaned it well and applied the right kind of antibiotic ointment, she said. But she's going to need oral antibiotics too, probably for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer depending on how deep the infection goes. From her backpack, she produced a well-stocked veterinary medical kit. She redressed Luna's wound with professional supplies, administered a stronger antibiotic injection, and checked both wolves for any other injuries Thomas might have missed. All the while she talked. About the wolves, about their pack, about their history. Luna and Apollo are siblings from the same litter, Elena explained as she worked. They're the youngest members of the Silver Ridge pack, about 3 years old. They were born during an unusually harsh winter, and for a while we didn't think they'd make it. But they're fighters, these two. They've always been inseparable. What happened to them? Thomas asked. How did they get separated from their pack? Elena's expression grew somber. There was a blizzard 3 weeks ago, one of the worst we've seen in years. The pack was hunting caribou, and the storm hit without warning. Most of the pack made it to shelter, but Luna and Apollo got cut off. We think Luna's injury happened during that time, probably from a fall or maybe a conflict with another predator. By the time the storm cleared, the pack had moved on, following the caribou migration. These two have been trying to catch up ever since. Why didn't the pack wait for them? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Wolf packs can't afford to wait, Elena said sadly. Especially not in winter. They have to follow the food or everyone starves. It's brutal, but it's the reality of survival up here. Luna and Apollo's mother probably mourned them. The whole pack probably mourned them. But nature doesn't allow for sentiment when survival is at stake. Thomas looked at the two wolves with new understanding and deeper compassion. They hadn't just been wandering lost in the wilderness. They'd been desperately trying to reunite with their family, driven by an urge that went beyond mere survival instinct. They'd been going home. So what happens now? Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Elena sat back on her heels, looking between the wolves and Thomas with an expression that held both hope and uncertainty. I have a facility about 30 miles from here, specially designed for situations exactly like this. We can treat Luna's injuries properly, make sure the infection doesn't spread, give them both proper nutrition and care. Once Luna's healed enough to travel, we can try to reunite them with their pack. Try. Thomas caught the qualification in her voice. Elena's expression grew troubled. Wolf packs have complex social dynamics. Sometimes they welcome back missing members, especially young wolves like these who haven't had time to establish their own territories. But sometimes, especially if the pack has been through stress or if new hierarchies have been established, they can reject former members. It's not personal, it's just the way things work. And if the pack rejects them? Thomas asked, though his heart already knew the answer would break it. Then we'll have to make other arrangements, Elena said carefully. There are wildlife sanctuaries, protected habitats where they could live out their lives in semi-wild conditions. They'd be safe, well-fed, cared for. It wouldn't be true freedom, but it would be a good life. Better than dying alone in the wilderness. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this information. Part of him wanted to argue, to insist that there must be another way, a better option. But he'd lived in this harsh land long enough to understand that sometimes there simply weren't perfect solutions. Sometimes you had to choose between difficult options and try to pick the one that caused the least harm. How soon can you transport them to your facility? He asked. Elena pulled out her satellite phone, checking the weather forecast. I'll need to call my team and arrange for proper transport. With the roads in their current condition and another storm potentially moving in, probably tomorrow at the earliest. Is that okay? Can they stay here another night? Of course, Thomas said immediately. They can stay as long as needed. Relief flooded Elena's face. Thank you, Mr. McAllister. Truly. What you've done for these wolves, the compassion you've shown, it's extraordinary. Most people would have been too frightened to even open their door. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. They were dying. I couldn't just leave them out there to freeze. Most people could, Elena said quietly. Most people would. The fact that you couldn't, the fact that you chose to help even at potential risk to yourself. That says something important about who you are. As evening fell and Elena made her calls to coordinate transportation, Thomas found himself studying the wolves with new eyes. Luna and Apollo. Siblings. Family. Separated from their pack and trying desperately to find their way home. He thought about his own life, his own years of isolation since Margaret's death. How long had he been separated from his own pack, his own family? His children lived thousands of miles away in cities he could barely imagine, raising grandchildren he'd never met. His friends from his younger years were mostly dead or moved away. He'd chosen solitude, chosen isolation, convinced himself it was what he needed. But watching these wolves huddle together for warmth and comfort, seeing the obvious love and loyalty between them, Thomas wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe isolation wasn't the same as peace. Maybe loneliness wasn't the same as independence. That night, Elena slept in Thomas's armchair, wrapped in the spare blanket, while Thomas took his usual spot in the loft. But he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the gentle breathing of two wolves and one dedicated researcher, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would this be his last night with Luna and Apollo? Would they be taken away to the facility, to be treated and healed and eventually released back into the wild where they belonged? The thought of the cabin returning to its former emptiness, its oppressive silence, made Thomas's chest tighten with unexpected grief. He'd only known these wolves for 2 days. 2 days out of his 72 years on Earth. And yet somehow, in that brief time, they'd managed to fill a hollow place inside him that he hadn't even realized existed. "Oh, Margaret," he whispered into the darkness. "What have I gotten myself into?" But deep in his heart, he knew she would have approved. She would have loved these wolves, would have opened their home to them without hesitation. She would have cried when they had to leave, just as Thomas suspected he would. As he finally drifted toward sleep, Thomas made a silent promise to himself, to Margaret's memory, and to the wolves sleeping below. Whatever happened tomorrow, however this story ended, he would make sure Luna and Apollo got the best chance at life that he could possibly give them. It was the least he could do for the creatures who had reminded him what it meant to have a purpose, to care about something beyond his own solitary existence. Thomas woke to Elena's urgent voice cutting through his sleep like a knife. "Mr. McAllister. Thomas. Wake up." He jerked upright, his heart hammering, fumbling for his glasses in the pre-dawn darkness. What is it?" "The weather forecast," Elena called up from the main room. "There's a major storm system moving in faster than predicted. My team can't make it here before it hits. We're going to be stuck here for at least another day, maybe 2. Thomas descended from his loft, groaning as his elderly joints protested the sudden movement. Elena stood by the window, her satellite phone pressed to her ear, her expression tight with worry. The wolves were awake and alert, sensing the tension in the humans around them. Apollo had positioned himself by the door, his body language radiating unease. "What about the roads?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Already becoming impassable," Elena confirmed, ending her call and turning to face him. "My team made it about halfway before they had to turn back. They said the wind is picking up and visibility is dropping fast. They'll try again as soon as the storm clears, but that could be 2 or 3 days from now." Thomas moved to the window and looked out at the dawning day. The sky was a bruised purple-gray, heavy with the promise of snow. The wind that had been merely annoying yesterday had developed a sharper edge, howling around the cabin's eaves like a living thing with malevolent intent. "We'd better get prepared then," Thomas said with the calm practicality of someone who'd survived dozens of harsh storms. "I'll need to bring in more firewood, make sure the generator is working, check my food supplies." "I'll help," Elena offered immediately. They spent the next 2 hours preparing the cabin for an extended siege by the elements. Thomas filled the wood box to overflowing, then stacked more logs along the interior wall for easy access. Elena helped him check and double-check his generator, his propane tanks, his emergency supplies. The wolves watched these preparations with keen interest, as if they understood the seriousness of the situation. They'd survived in the wilderness long enough to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, the particular quality of light and wind that preceded nature's most violent moods. Around mid-morning, with the storm beginning to intensify, Thomas ventured outside one final time to gather more wood from his storage shed. The cold was already brutal, the wind driving ice crystals into any exposed skin like tiny needles. He worked quickly, loading his arms with as much wood as he could carry. That's when he noticed the tracks. Fresh ones, not more than an hour old, leading from the tree line toward his cabin, then circling around toward the back of the property. Large tracks, definitely from something heavy. But the pattern was wrong for a moose or a bear. These were more deliberate, more purposeful. Thomas's heart began to pound as he scanned the tree line, his experienced eyes searching for any sign of movement. At first he saw nothing, just the endless expanse of snow-covered forest bending beneath the strengthening wind. Then, at the very edge of his vision, a shadow moved among the trees. Thomas dropped his armload of wood and ran for the cabin, his elderly legs pumping harder than they had in years. He burst through the door, startling Elena and sending both wolves into high alert. "Someone's out there," he gasped, slamming the door shut and throwing the bolt. "I saw tracks circling the cabin, and there's someone in the trees." Elena's face went pale. "Are you sure? Could it be an animal?" "I know the difference between animal tracks and human tracks," Thomas said grimly, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. "Someone's been watching the cabin." As if to confirm his words, Apollo suddenly exploded into furious barking, racing to the window and snarling at something outside. Luna struggled to her feet despite her injured leg, adding her own howls to the cacophony. "Easy, easy," Elena called out, trying to calm the agitated wolves. But even she looked frightened now. Thomas moved to the window, rifle in hand, and peered out through the frost. At first he saw nothing but swirling snow and wind-bent trees. Then a figure emerged from the tree line, moving with surprising speed despite the brutal conditions. It was another person bundled in heavy winter gear but definitely human. They were heading straight for the cabin. "Dr. Rodriguez," a man's voice called out, barely audible over the wind. "Elena. It's Dan. Let me in before I freeze to death out here." Elena's expression shifted from fear to confusion. "Dan? What's he doing here?" She rushed to the door and pulled it open. A large man practically fell inside, bringing a blast of Arctic air and swirling snow with him. He was heavily built, with a salt and pepper beard crusted with ice, and his face was bright red from the cold. "What the hell are you doing here?" Elena demanded, helping him brush off the accumulated snow. "I told you and Nina to turn back." "We did," Dan gasped, his breath coming in heavy clouds. "But I couldn't just leave you out here. The storm's worse than we thought, Elena. Much worse. I left Nina with the truck and snowmobiled as far as I could, then hiked the last 2 miles when the terrain got too rough." He stopped suddenly as he caught sight of the 2 wolves, who were both growling low in their chests, hackles raised. His eyes widened. "You found them," he breathed. "You actually found Luna and Apollo." "This is Dan Fletcher," Elena explained to Thomas quickly. "He's my research partner, works with me at the Wildlife Center. Dan, this is Thomas McAllister. He's the one who took them in, treated Luna's injuries, probably saved both their lives." Dan extended a gloved hand to Thomas, who shook it cautiously. "Thank you," Dan said with obvious sincerity. "We've been going crazy with worry about these 2. "How did you find us?" Thomas asked. "Followed Elena's tracking signal," Dan explained, pulling off his ice-crusted gloves and moving toward the fire gratefully. "And I brought proper supplies for the wolves. Medical equipment, food, portable kennels if we need them." He knelt slowly, extending his hand toward Apollo with the practiced confidence of someone who'd worked with wolves before. "Hey there, big guy. Remember me? I'm the one who let you steal that whole salmon from my cooler last summer." Apollo's growl softened slightly, his tail giving a tentative wag. Clearly he did remember. "The storm's going to be bad," Dan continued, addressing both Elena and Thomas now. "Nina's hunkered down with the truck about 15 miles from here, but she's got shelter and supplies. She'll be fine. But we're going to be stuck here until it passes. Could be 2 days, could be 3. We need to make sure we have everything we need for both the humans and the wolves." Thomas nodded, mentally calculating his food supplies. "I can stretch what I have for 3 people for a few days, no problem. And I've got enough venison and other meat to keep the wolves fed. I brought specialized wolf food in my pack," Dan said. "High protein, formulated specifically for injured or recovering wolves. It'll be better for Luna than raw meat while her body's fighting that infection." As the 3 humans discussed logistics and prepared for the long siege ahead, the storm outside intensified dramatically. The wind began to scream around the cabin with a fury that made even Thomas, with his decades of experience, feel a flutter of real fear. This wasn't just a bad storm. This was the kind of weather that killed people who weren't properly prepared. By noon, visibility outside had dropped to almost nothing. The world beyond Thomas's windows was just a swirling white chaos, the wind so powerful it shook the sturdy log walls of the cabin. The temperature plummeted to dangerous, deadly levels. But inside, the cabin was warm and relatively comfortable. The fire roared in the hearth. The generator hummed steadily, keeping the lights on. And 7 beings, 3 human and 4 soon-to-be-discovered wolves, settled in to wait out nature's fury. That's when they heard it. A new sound, barely audible beneath the storm's rage, but unmistakable once you focused on it. Scratching at the back door. Weak, desperate scratching, accompanied by whimpering that made all 3 humans freeze. "There's another wolf out there," Thomas said, his heart sinking. Elena and Dan exchanged shocked looks. "That's impossible," Elena whispered. Luna and Apollo were the only 2 who got separated from the pack. The GPS collars confirmed it. "Maybe the collar malfunctioned," Dan suggested. "Or maybe this wolf is from a different pack entirely." Thomas was already moving toward the back door, concern overriding caution. "Whoever it is, they'll die if we leave them out there." He pulled open the door and found himself looking down at a 3rd wolf, even more emaciated and desperate than Luna and Apollo had been. This one was smaller, with a patchy coat that suggested severe malnutrition and injuries. It looked up at Thomas with eyes that held nothing but exhaustion and the faintest flicker of hope. Behind Thomas, Apollo's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The male wolf let out a howl that made the cabin's windows rattle, then began pacing frantically, whining and barking in obvious distress. "It's Mercury," Elena breathed, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. Apollo and Luna's younger brother. We thought he was dead. The pieces suddenly fell into place in Thomas's mind. Not two wolves separated from their pack. 3. An entire family of siblings scattered and lost in the storm, each one thinking they'd lost the others forever. Without thinking, without hesitating, Thomas knelt in the doorway despite the bitter cold and extended his hand to the third wolf. Come on, he said softly. Your family's waiting for you. The moment Mercury limped across the threshold, supported by Thomas on one side and Dan on the other, the cabin erupted into chaos. But it wasn't violent chaos. It was the chaos of joy, of reunion, of family members who'd believed they'd never see each other again suddenly finding themselves together. Apollo bounded toward his brother with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for a creature who'd been half-starved just days ago. He bowled into Mercury, nearly knocking the smaller wolf over, and began frantically licking his face and nuzzling him with such obvious relief and joy that Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. Luna struggled to her feet despite her injured leg, whining and wagging her tail so hard her entire back end swayed. She hobbled toward her brothers, and soon all three wolves were pressed together in a tangle of fur and tails and desperately affectionate whimpers. They're trying to make sure it's real, Elena whispered, her own eyes wet with tears. Making sure this isn't a dream. The three humans stood back and watched the reunion, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. These weren't just wolves. They were a family separated by tragedy and brought back together by a combination of chance, determination, and the compassion of strangers. After several minutes of intense greeting, the wolves finally calmed enough to allow the humans to approach. Mercury was in even worse condition than his siblings had been. In addition to severe malnutrition, he had several infected scratches, frostbite on multiple paws, and what looked like a broken rib that had healed improperly. How did he survive? Thomas wondered aloud as Dan gently examined the youngest wolf. Sheer stubbornness probably, Dan replied. And the desperate need to find his family. Wolves have been known to travel hundreds of miles when separated from their packs, ignoring injuries, starvation, everything because the drive to reunite is so powerful. Elena was busy administering antibiotics and pain medication to Mercury while Apollo and Luna hovered nearby, clearly anxious about their brother but trusting these humans enough not to interfere. The interesting thing, Elena said as she worked, is that they found each other here. At Thomas's cabin. Out of all the thousands of square miles of wilderness, all three of them somehow ended up at the same place. Maybe it wasn't chance, Thomas said quietly. Maybe they were all following the same instinct. Looking for shelter, for warmth, for help. And maybe this cabin, being one of the few sources of human presence in this whole wilderness, acted like a beacon. That night, as the storm raged outside with unprecedented fury, Thomas's small cabin held 6 beings huddled around a roaring fire. The 3 wolves lay in a pile of fur and limbs, unable to bear being separated even for a moment after their ordeal. Elena, Dan, and Thomas took turns feeding the fire, monitoring the wolves' conditions and sharing stories of their lives. Thomas learned that Elena had been studying wolves for nearly 20 years, that her passion for these creatures had cost her a marriage and any chance at a conventional life, but that she'd never regretted it for a moment. Dan talked about growing up in Minnesota, about the first wolf he'd ever seen in the wild, and how that moment had changed the entire trajectory of his life. And Thomas, after years of keeping his grief private and hidden, found himself talking about Margaret. About their life together in the cabin, about her death, about the 5 years of loneliness that had followed. She would have loved this, he said softly, looking at the pile of sleeping wolves. She always said that the world revealed its greatest wonders to those brave enough to open their doors. The storm continued through the entire next day and into the following night. The 3 humans and 3 wolves settled into a strange kind of domesticity, everyone adapting to the unusual circumstances with remarkable flexibility. Apollo appointed himself the guardian of his siblings, refusing to let them out of his sight. Luna's injury showed steady improvement under Elena's expert care. And Mercury, despite his rough condition, seemed to gain strength by the hour, as if the simple act of being reunited with his family was better medicine than anything the humans could provide. On the 3rd day, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down from a scream to a mere howl, and the snow stopped falling from the sky. The world outside Thomas's windows transformed from a white chaos into a pristine, frozen landscape that sparkled in the weak winter sunlight. Elena's satellite phone crackled to life with a call from Nina, confirming that the roads were being cleared and that transport could be arranged within 24 hours. The cabin fell into a contemplative silence as everyone absorbed what this meant. Tomorrow the wolves would leave. They'd be taken to the Wildlife Research Center, treated and monitored and eventually, hopefully, released back into the wild to rejoin their pack. Thomas tried to feel happy about this. It was the right outcome, the best possible scenario given the circumstances. But his heart felt heavy with impending loss. That evening, as everyone prepared for their final night together, Thomas sat in his armchair and watched the three wolves sleep by the fire. Apollo noticed him looking and raised his head, those intelligent amber eyes meeting Thomas's gaze. The wolf stood slowly and padded over to Thomas's chair. Then, in a gesture that Thomas knew he would remember until his dying day, Apollo laid his massive head on Thomas's knee and closed his eyes. "I'm going to miss you too," Thomas whispered, running his hand gently through the wolf's thick fur. "All of you." Morning came with crystalline clarity, the storms passing, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glittering under a brilliant sun. The sight of so much pristine beauty should have lifted Thomas's spirits. Instead, it only reminded him that this was the day the wolves would leave. Nina arrived just after noon, driving a specially equipped vehicle designed for transporting large animals. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put the wolves at ease. The transport crates they brought were spacious and well ventilated, lined with soft bedding and equipped with water bottles. But they were still cages, and Thomas's heart clenched at the sight of them. "We'll keep all three together in the largest crate," Elena assured him, noticing his distress. "They won't be separated and the journey isn't long. Just a couple hours to the research center." Loading the wolves proved surprisingly easy. They'd grown to trust the humans over the past few days, and when Apollo calmly walked into the crate after Elena, his siblings followed without hesitation. Still, Thomas noticed they all looked back at him as the crate door closed, and he had to look away before his vision blurred completely. "You saved their lives," Dan said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You gave them a second chance when anyone else would have been too frightened to even try. That's not something to feel sad about." "I know," Thomas said, his voice rough. "But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your heart are two different things." Elena approached him as Dan and Nina secured the crate in the vehicle. "I meant what I said before. You're welcome to visit them at the center anytime. And when we release them back to the wild if you want to be there." "I do," Thomas said immediately. "I absolutely do." She handed him a card with her contact information and the address of the research center. "Call me in a few weeks. By then, Luna should be fully healed and we'll have a better idea of when we can attempt the reunion with their pack." Thomas watched the vehicle pull away, its taillights disappearing down the snow-covered road, carrying three wolves and a piece of his heart with them. He stood on his porch long after they'd vanished, staring at the empty expanse of white, feeling the silence settle around him like a shroud. When he finally went back inside, the cabin felt impossibly empty. The blankets the wolves had slept on were still arranged by the fire. The bowls he'd used to feed them sat clean and unused in his kitchen. Even the air seemed different, lacking some vital quality it had possessed when the cabin was full of life. Thomas sank into his armchair and buried his face in his hands. The weeks that followed were among the hardest Thomas had experienced since Margaret's death. The cabin had never felt so empty, so oppressively silent. Every morning he woke expecting to hear the soft sounds of wolves breathing, the gentle click of claws on wooden floors. Every evening he caught himself preparing extra portions of food before remembering they were gone. He called Elena weekly for updates. Luna's infection had cleared completely, and her leg was healing well. Mercury had gained back most of the weight he'd lost and was thriving under professional care. Apollo remained the protective guardian, but he'd relaxed considerably now that his siblings were safe and well-fed. "They're doing wonderfully," Elena told him during one call. "In another 2 weeks, we think Luna will be strong enough to attempt a release. We've been tracking the Silver Ridge pack, and they're in their traditional winter territory. The timing could be perfect." Thomas tried to feel excited about this news, but all he felt was a deepening sadness. Once the wolves were released, he'd probably never see them again. They'd return to their wild lives and he'd return to his solitary existence, and their paths would never cross again. Spring came early that year, arriving in March with unexpected warmth and the first tentative signs of green pushing through melting snow. Thomas's greenhouse tomatoes flourished. His firewood supply, depleted by the weeks of caring for the wolves, was slowly replenished. Life returned to its predictable rhythms. But something fundamental had changed in Thomas McAllister. The isolation that had once felt like peace now felt like prison. The silence that had once been comforting now felt oppressive. He found himself thinking about his children, his grandchildren, all the family he'd distanced himself from in his grief. One evening he picked up his rarely used phone and called his daughter in Seattle. "Dad." Her voice, when she answered, held surprise and immediate concern. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Thomas said. I wanted to hear your voice. How are my grandchildren?" They talked for 2 hours. He learned that his grandson was excelling at baseball, that his granddaughter had just been accepted to college, that his daughter had been promoted at her job. He shared stories about the wolves, about his unexpected role as a caretaker, about how 3 desperate creatures had reminded him what it meant to care about something beyond yourself. "You should come visit us, Dad," his daughter said before they hung up. "The kids ask about you all the time. They'd love to meet their grandfather in person instead of just hearing about the crazy old hermit who lives in Alaska." "Maybe I will," Thomas said. And for the first time in 5 years he meant it. Epilogue: Going home. 6 weeks after the wolves had left his cabin, Thomas received the call he'd been both anticipating and dreading. "It's time," Elena said, her voice bright with excitement. "Luna's fully healed, all 3 wolves are strong and healthy, and we've located the Silver Ridge Pack. We're going to attempt the release tomorrow at dawn. Can you be here?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes." He drove through the night, his old truck rattling over roads that had been mere suggestions of paths when he'd first arrived in Alaska 40 years ago. The research center was located in a vast wilderness preserve, thousands of acres of protected land where wolves could roam free under minimal human observation. Elena and Dan met him at the facility before dawn. Through the windows of a large, comfortable enclosure, Thomas could see Luna, Apollo, and Mercury. They looked transformed. Their coats were thick and lustrous, their bodies filled out to proper weight. They moved with confidence and power, every inch the magnificent predators they were meant to be. "They've been incredible," Elena said softly. "The bond between them is so strong. I've never seen siblings this devoted to each other." As if sensing they were being watched, Apollo turned and looked directly at the window where Thomas stood. For a moment, man and wolf regarded each other one final time. Then Apollo's tail wagged just once, and Thomas knew he'd been recognized and remembered. They transported the wolves in the same spacious crate they'd used before, driving deep into the preserve to a location where the Silver Ridge Pack had last been spotted. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. "This is it," Elena said, her hand on the crate's release mechanism. "Are you ready?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Elena opened the crate. For a moment nothing happened. The 3 wolves sat inside, looking out at the vast wilderness that had almost killed them, at the freedom they'd fought so hard to reclaim. Then Apollo stepped out, his head lifting, his nose working the air. He'd caught a scent. Behind him, Luna and Mercury emerged, both moving with strength and confidence that would have been impossible just weeks ago. Apollo turned back one final time. He looked at Elena, at Dan, and finally at Thomas. His eyes held intelligence, memory, and something that might have been gratitude. Then he threw back his head and howled. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape, primal and beautiful and free. Luna and Mercury joined in, their voices blending into a harmony that seemed to shake the very sky. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came an answering chorus. The Silver Ridge Pack calling their lost children home. Without a backward glance, the 3 wolves ran. They moved as one, a family reunited, their powerful legs carrying them swiftly across the snow toward the sound of their pack, toward home, toward the wild life they were meant to live. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the trees, becoming one with the forest, indistinguishable from the wilderness that had given them birth. Tears streamed down his weathered face, but he was smiling. "Goodbye, Luna," he whispered. "Goodbye, Apollo. Goodbye, Mercury. Thank you for reminding me what it means to be alive." Elena stood beside him, her own eyes wet with tears. "They'll be okay," she said softly. "Because of you, they'll be okay." As the sun rose higher, painting the world in light, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The hollow place that had existed since Margaret's death, the emptiness that he'd thought could never be filled, suddenly felt less oppressive. Not filled exactly, but acknowledged, accepted. Part of him, but not all of him. He had helped 3 wolves find their way home. Maybe it was time for him to find his way home too. Not to Alaska necessarily, but to his family. To his children and grandchildren. To the pack he'd distanced himself from in his grief. That evening, Thomas called his daughter again. "About that visit," he said. "How does next month sound?" Her delighted squeal made him smile wider than he had in 5 years. Sometimes, Thomas would reflect in the years that followed, the universe conspires to bring together exactly the right beings at exactly the right time. 3 desperate wolves had found their way to his door in their darkest hour. And in saving them, in opening his heart to their need, Thomas had somehow saved himself. He never saw Luna, Apollo, or Mercury again. But every year, on the anniversary of that frigid night when 2 frozen wolves had first scratched at his door, Thomas would stand on his porch and listen to the distant howling of the Silver Ridge Pack. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the night was clear, he could swear he heard 3 familiar voices among the chorus, calling out across the wilderness, singing their song of survival and family and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living things. This is a story about 3 wolves who came in from the cold. But more than that, it's a story about one man who opened his door, and in doing so, opened his heart. Asterisk: if this tale of compassion, survival, and unexpected connection has touched your heart, please share it. Let others know that even in our darkest, coldest moments, warmth and wonder are still possible. That family, whether blood or chosen, is worth fighting for. That the simple act of opening your door to someone in need can change not just their life, but yours as well. Asterisk. Thank you for listening to this story. May you always have the courage to open your door when desperate souls come calling in the night. Asterisk.